right, welcome everyone to this week's Autonomy Talk. This week is a great pleasure to have with us Lisa Lee, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Something about Lisa. So first of all, I thought her name was Lisa, but let's be specific here. Her name is Jing Xuan Li, for the friends Lisa, I guess. And she received a Bachelor's of Applied Science from the University of Toronto, and then a PhD in Control and Dynamical Systems from Caltech. And she joined Michigan in the fall 2023. Her research interests are around optimal control, distributed control, and resource and communication constraint control, sensory motor control, and large-scale systems. So a broad interest in diverse classes of systems. And today's talk is going to be about optimal control in sensory motor systems. I am particularly interested in her research because of all the different scales that are at play and the different architectures. Therefore, I really look forward to hearing more about it, and I give you the stage, Lisa.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for inviting me. So feel free at any time to raise your hand or put questions in the chat, and I will try to answer them. Okay, so I was thinking about my work, which is roughly at the intersection of control theory. So here's a little standard control, controller plus plant, which I will call a dynamical system here, because when you talk to biologists, there will be someone in the room who is actually thinking of literal plants. So I'm going to call it a dynamical system, and also sensorimotor neuroscience. And my research has kind of two steps of aims. The first is to use control theory to create models of sensorimotor systems. And we also want to use these models to better understand, what the sensorimotor system is doing, how it's doing it. So in other words, we don't just want to replicate what we see. We want to replicate what we see and then, additionally get some other insight. Now, the title of this seminar series is Autonomy Talks. So I did think a little bit about what is the relation between this and artificial autonomy. And very broadly, we can say that, artificial autonomy can take inspiration from natural autonomy. Animals are, after all, very good at autonomy. If we were able to make an autonomous system that was, as good as an animal, I think we would be very happy. Okay, now how exactly can this take place? So I'm going to be a little bit more detailed with how exactly we can take inspiration. But to do that, I'm going to have to introduce this thing called Mars 3 levels of analysis. So this is an analytic system that is used in neuroscience. So roughly speaking, the 3 levels go like this. The highest level, what they call computation, is the high level goal of whatever autonomous or system that you have. The middle level is what they call the algorithm. So it's the math, the equations that you use, the algorithm that you use to carry out whatever high level goal you're trying to achieve. And finally, the lowest level is implementation, which is the physical hardware upon which you are trying to do these computation and algorithms. So I can give some examples. If we look at sensorimotor neuroscience, a common high level goal is reach to grasp. So we do this a lot every day. We grasp computer mouse, coffee mug, pencil, whatever. And in terms of the algorithms underlying this, well, there's reasonable experimental and scientific evidence that you can use things like optimal control and learning models to model reach to grasp. Okay, so behaviorally, reach to grasp, optimal control, and learning all come together. And in terms of implementation, for organisms at least, they are using neural circuits and muscles to implement this algorithm that allows them to perform the task. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Now we can have a parallel example for artificial autonomy. So I've picked the same task because we also want robots to reach and grasp. And broadly speaking, we use the same algorithms, which is optimal control and learning. But the implementation is quite different because now we're working with microcontroller, we're working with torque motors. And what I wanted to highlight at the beginning of this talk is that what we typically think of when we say autonomy is strictly at the algorithm level. If you look at publication, if you look at discourse, mostly it's surrounding algorithm. If we find an algorithm that does the task, we're happy. But in terms of comparisons to nature, I would argue that actually there's the biggest difference at the moment is in the implementation. And what I look at is implementation and algorithm in neuroscience. But for autonomy, I think there's some opportunities to investigate things like energy efficiency, because the implementation is fundamentally where sensorimotor neuroscience is saving a lot of energy compared to our computerized algorithms. And also ideas such as co-design and embodied intelligence, which is to say that an animal is not a brain and a body. It's much more integrated than this. The neural circuits go from the brain to the midbrain to the spine to the peripheral nervous system. And all of this is intricately co-designed and co-evolved. Whereas oftentimes for autonomy, we're still very much in the space of someone has given me an arm, let's make the arm do this. And so what I'm going to talk about today is not really related to autonomy, but I just wanted to give that kind of background linkage. So I'm going to be talking about sensorimotor neuroscience and control theory from both algorithm and implementation perspective. Okay, so now I'm going to talk more about control theory and neuroscience. So it's not the most conventional of intersections, so I have to give some justification here. So control theory models explain various biomechanical phenomena across a variety of behavioral contexts and animals. Let me break down this sentence a little bit. So the types of control theory models that are used to do these sensorimotor models are typically very simple, shall we say. So proportional integral derivative, PID, or simple optimal models like linear quadratic regulator or linear quadratic Gaussian. These models are used to try to replicate things like limb trajectories, so how your arm moves through space, interaction forces, especially for locomotion, and also muscle activations. So you're not confined to one specific biomechanical entity. You can do whatever matches your experiment. In terms of behaviors, again, you're not confined to a simple behavior. You can model flight, flapping, walking, reaching, balancing, any of the relatively simple sensorimotor tasks, you can use these simple models for. And last of all, animals. You can use control theory models for any animal. Common ones include us, humans, bats and salamanders, fruit flies, monkeys, mice. Essentially, whatever sensorimotor experiment you can do, it is likely that you are going to be able to model some bit of it with control theory. Okay. So this is relatively established in the literature. Here's 4 nice papers if we are curious about them. And why do people use control theory as a model? Because it's definitely not the only branch of math or modeling that exists. And there's several benefits to this. One is that control theory models are very easy to interpret. If you're using like PID or LQR, it is very easy to tell what your controller is doing. It also gives you a prior model of sorts, so you don't need to gather experimental data before you embark on the modeling process. Now, you can do some iteration between them, but it's not a model that's reliant on data. Additionally, the fact that you can use control theory to do models of all these different animals, movements, quantities, and so on suggests that there's maybe some general principles we can extract using this type of modeling method. And in addition to, different animals and different tasks, we can also use control theory for different parts and different scales of the body. So for example, spinal circuits are like a couple of neurons going from, let's say, your arm to your spine and back to your arm. You can use control theory for that. You can look at specific circuits in the brain, and you can also look at circuits of different size. So microcircuits is when you know exactly what every neuron is doing. And macrocircuit is more like if we're thinking of the entire sensorimotor pathway, let's say from the vision to the movement. And then when we move, we see something, so it goes in a loop. That's billions of neurons. You can also model that loop with control theory. And control theory also provides the mathematical framework that puts together many aspects of sensorimotor control. So as I allude to, when we want to study the entire loop, there's lots of disparate elements that are often studied separately. So sensory processing is its own field. Neural computation is its own field. Biomechanics is its own field. And being different fields, they often have somewhat different languages, but control theory offers at least a point where everyone can try to converge and put everything together in one framework or loop of analysis. Okay, those are the good things. Of course, I have to tell you the good things, but there are also downsides. The first challenge is that it's obviously a very interdisciplinary work. And so you're either trying to teach neuroscience to control theorists, or you're trying to teach control theory to neuroscientists. Neither is, very easy. So it's always a work to come to the middle, with collaborators and try to figure out what problem is mathematically tractable. The other challenge is more of a philosophical one. So usually when we apply control theory, we're applying it for design. You get given a system and you have to give some controller and some guarantees for it. You know what the system is and you know what the controller is because, that's the nature of the problem. But when you're trying to use control theory to model a sensorimotor system, you're not necessarily designing anything. The full closed loop is already there for you. And you have to pick how you're setting up the problem, how you're dividing up, the controller and the plant. And so problem setup becomes more of an issue than it would be if we're doing conventional controls. Okay, so this is kind of a very high level overview of control theory and sensorimotor neuroscience. And now I'm going to get a little bit more specific with how exactly someone would go about making a controller. Okay, so I gave you a bunch of examples of like modeling limb trajectories and reaching. And those are what I would call behavioral or algorithm level models. So going back to the 3 levels of analysis, this is in the middle, right? It's the math that is used to achieve the behavior. Okay, so if I'm a control theorist and I want to make a model, first, I need a model of the system, the dynamical system. This can be a relatively simplified model. So if you're trying to do reaching, you can make like a, arm model with torque control, for example. Okay, you have a dynamical system, you have some objectives, and perhaps you have some constraints. Once you have these, you can formulate them for the controller design paradigm that you like. So you can tune a PID controller, or you can make an LQR controller. You can make an MPC controller if you're very fancy. But once you make the controller, then you can do simulations with your controller plus your dynamical system, and that'll give you simulated trajectories, for example. So if we're using an arm, then we can simulate, trajectories for the arm. Okay. Before or after or during this, you also have an experiment. You get a person in the lab or a monkey, and you get them to do the reach, and then you record the experimental data. And typically, if there's a decent match, you can argue that this is a good model. I talked a little bit about the control design technically being data-free, but of course, you can always do parameter tuning. So if you're doing something like a linear quadratic objective, you have penalty matrices Q and R. You can guess at what they are, but it's hard to say priori exactly what values they are. And so a typical modeling process is you would, let's say you do LQR, it kind of matches, you look at the experiment, you tune your Q and R, and you try it again and try to get the best comparison. So there's places that you can fit data into this design process, but fundamentally, I would still argue it's relatively non-reliant on data. Okay, and this will tell you if the animal is behaving like a controller, and the general consensus from literature is that it does. Now, the open question and the bit that I'm going to talk about next is the neurophysiological or the implementation model. So this is going back to the 3 levels. This is the lowest level. How exactly is this behavior or this algorithm implemented in the controller and in the organism? And what I mean by that is our organism has neural circuits that presumably carry out these LQ or PI computations. And how can we better understand what these circuits are doing, through a controller perspective? Okay. So I'm going to, if we have time, talk about these 2 works. And I'm going to start with the one on the left, which is internal feedback and controller structure. So this is looking at controller structure and what we can say about neural circuits. Now, looking at neural circuits for primates and humans is a pretty daunting task because humans have on the order of like 80 billion neurons. And so for this work, what we focused on was not a specific circuit, but rather a circuit motif that occurs throughout the sensorimotor loop. And this motif we're going to call internal feedback. Okay, so here we have the brain and the body and environment. So I've kind of forced the animal into the controller and plant dichotomy. And this is the standard control feedback loop, right? So something happens in the body and or environment, you sense it, and then your brain does some computation. It communicates, throughout the brain, throughout the nervous system. And then you use this sensory information to decide your actuation, and then you act on the environment. And then this again undergoes some dynamics, and you sense and you compute and you act in this loop. Okay, this is just the very standard feedback loop. Now, we're talking about circuit motifs, and so we're looking inside the brain. And so what we're calling internal feedback is information flow within the controller, so within the brain, in the opposite direction. So it's from actuation back towards sensing. So in the opposite direction of the external feedback loop. I'm going to be more precise about this now, and we're going to go to the visual motor system. Okay, so again, billions of neurons in here. Every one of these blocks is at least millions of neurons, but the general pathways are established in literature. So this is how, roughly speaking, we do control based on visual information. We have our body and environment, and for visual motor, we're sensing through the eye. So we see something, the eye senses kind of like pixel level information, and this pixel level information gets sent to the thalamus in the brain, where it's still, roughly speaking, a pixel representation. Then it gets sent to visual cortex, which is in the back of the head in the wrinkly part of the brain, for those of you that don't know what cortex is. Okay, so we sense pixels. Now V1 is where the processing starts to happen. So you start seeing things like edge detection. And as it gets passed along to these higher levels of processing, I'm not going to talk about them anatomically, but roughly speaking, we're going from pixels to edges to objects to semantics, so object motion and object identity, at which point the brain then sends this information down to motor cortex, and motor cortex then talks to the spine talks to the muscles, and then you act. Okay, so the anatomical detail is not super important, but the rough picture is we see raw information, we process the information, and we use that information to determine the action. This is one giant feed-forward loop. And this loop makes a lot of sense even in the context of things such as machine learning or convolutional neural nets, where this first part I've described, from pixels to edges to semantics, is basically how convolutional neural nets work. But remembering the motif we care about, which is internal feedback, there's plenty of internal feedback within the visual motor system. So there's a lot of feedback within motor areas, from motor back to visual areas, and also from, let's say, higher levels of processing, so objects, back down to lower levels of processing. So from objects back to edges, back to pixels. Okay, so all these arrows are basically millions of neural axons projecting from here to there. Okay, so this is the motif. It's very well noted, and so it's been studied quite a lot, and there's a lot of existing models for this. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of them, but a summary of them can be like this. Most of these models are for vision. So they model kind of these arrows, but they don't look at these motor to vision arrows. And they're very visual based. So what we did for this work was we asked, okay, well, since we know that this whole loop can be modeled like a controller, why don't we try to look at this internal feedback motif in controllers and see if we can say anything about that. Okay, so let's look at controllers. Okay, so here's a PID controller in block diagram form. We have the proportional, the integrator, and the derivative. You add them up, and then you actuate. So this is purely external feedback. There's no internal feedback. Everything is going from sensing to actuation. We can also look at LQR, the other controller I talked about. LQR, as those of you know, it's a matrix multiplication, essentially. So again, there's no structure in here. It's just one gain, and then everything goes out. Okay. Now there's one more controller, which is LQG, and if we look at the linear quadratic Gaussian, then indeed we can see some sources of internal feedback. So here is a linear time invariant discrete time system on the bottom right. This should look very familiar, hopefully. And on the top, we have the linear quadratic Gaussian output feedback controller in the way it's presented in textbooks. And if you take this and just translate it very literally to a block diagram, this is the diagram that you would get. And this diagram is actually quite nice, because not only does it have internal feedback, it also is very easily interpretable. So here we have these kind of three paths through A, B, and C matrices, and we know what they're doing. So the path through A is a state model prediction. So remember, A is the autonomous model of the system with no input. So we're saying we have a model in our brain of how the external world changes if we don't do anything. And that's exactly represented by this pathway here. For B, it is we have a model of how our actions affect the external world. And again, this is a feedback path. And this is actually related to the idea of the efference copy, if you've heard of that in neuroscience. And finally, we have an idea of, how the world's objects relate to sensing. So, how a cup might look after I've pushed it. And so if I've pushed the cup, then I can predict that I'll see the cup translate, right? And that's the sensing model prediction. Okay, so this is great. Now, let's try to map this back to the brain. So now we want to ask, how do we implement this in the organism? And the conventional idea that people go through is that they'll say, let's look for parts of the brain that do these things. Because as I mentioned, these three paths have very clear meanings. And so let's think about which part of the brain does, state prediction, which part of the brain does actuation prediction. Maybe it's a parietal cortex and a cerebellum. And then you go on your way trying to do this sort of functional matching. This is what basically everyone does. But more recently, I have come to the conclusion that this is not the case, because it is not a unique implementation. You can change the gains here, you can change the numbers, and you can still keep the same input and output behavior. So you can have completely different internal gains, but still have the same input and output behavior. So going back to those three levels of analysis, same algorithm, different implementation. Okay, so this is not very good, because if you change the gains, then you lose all of these nice interpretations. And in fact, you don't even have to have the same kind of wiring diagram. You can take this, sorry, let me go back. So you can take this, put it into transfer function, and then take the transfer function and do a realization on it. And that's going to take you out to this kind of shape. Okay, and again, none of the gains here are obvious. And at this point, none of these things really mean anything very clear. So what can we say about internal feedback from what we've learned so far? Well, the only thing that we can really say for sure is that in the output feedback setting, where you are sensing imperfectly, the optimal controller must have internal dynamics. So conclusively, you cannot actually implement this controller with just static black lines. You do need the internal feedback for dynamics. So internal dynamics are required for estimation, and so you need internal feedback. It's not the most satisfying answer, but this is an open question that I'm still working on. Now, there's other considerations when we're thinking about implementation. So far, I've just been playing around with block diagrams. I haven't actually done anything very related to the brain. Okay, well, for animals, there are sensorimotor delays everywhere due to neural circuit and muscle properties. So microcontrollers and motors that we work with in robots typically will have quite a lot less delay than animals. Okay, and every animal from humans to flies have sensorimotor delays. This is a nice diagram explaining that, borrowed from this paper. So here is a circuit that is purely spinal. It's just going from the leg up to the spine and back down to the leg. It doesn't even go to the brain. So this is a very fast circuit. But even this fast circuit has a net delay of on the order of 30 to 40 milliseconds. So you sense a stimulus, and then this, let's say you step on something very sharp, and you have to conduct information about this to the spine. That conduction takes time. That's this purple block here. That conduction takes time, and then that neuron synapses or talks to another neuron, and that neuron then has to conduct back down. So that neuron kind of sends the motor command. That conduction is the second purple block here, also takes time. Once the signal has been sent to the muscle, now the muscle has to transduce the electrical neuron signal to a mechanical signal, so neuromuscular junction. That also takes time. That's this dark green circle, or sorry, block. And finally, once the transduction has happened, it still takes some time for the muscle to actually ramp up the force. That's this final very large block. Okay, so conduction delay and muscular delay both play a role. And this delay would be even bigger if you included the brain in this loop. So, okay, so then we said, let's look at now control with delays and see if we can say anything about that. So we went back to the linear quadratic regulator. So this is state feedback. You can sense the state directly. And we wanted to ask what's the simplest way to put a motor delay into this controller. Okay, and the simplest way is to just add a motor delay block. So without delay, your system would look like U equals KX. With delay, your system now looks like U equals KX, but after you've decided what actuation you want, you need to let there be a motor delay before you actually enact this on the system. So in terms of equations, now we are going to call the real state x1 t plus 1 equals ax1t plus b x2t instead of u. So x2 is the actual delayed actuation. And u now is an internal signal in the brain that's intended actuation. It's a very confusing nomenclature, but the reason that we do this is because if you name everything this way, then what you can do is massage everything, stack your variables together, and massage everything into a standard discrete time linear problem. And if you have a standard discrete time linear problem, you can just apply a standard off-the-shelf LQR solver to get your optimal controller, which will be U equals to KX. If we split this out in terms of x1 and x2, it's going to be U equals K1 x1 plus K2 x2. Now here in this diagram, we have U equals K1 x1, but to have K2 x2, we would need a little kind of loop from x2. Okay, so here's a little source of internal feedback. And just to convince you that indeed having this source is better than not having it, we did this simple simulation here. So here on the y-axis is the normalized log cost. So it's just the LQR, the linear quadratic cost, a linear combination of quadratic state penalty plus input penalty. We did this with a scalar system, and so the task difficulty is just the A in the scalar system. When a discrete system, 1 is the stability boundary, so less than 1 means the system is stable. The cost will go to 0, by itself, and the above 1 is unstable. So if you don't do anything, then the system will diverge. Okay, if you have no delays at all, that's the baseline. That's this line at the bottom, performs well. If you have this structure, precisely as pictured, then as you increase your difficulty or as you get more unstable, the performance gets worse and worse along this trend. But if you enforce a delay and do not allow this feedback path, where you just make K2 to be 0 and find the optimal K1, then your cost will scale like this. And at this point, you can no longer stabilize the system and you just diverge to infinity. Okay, so it is better to have feedback than not. And you can also have multiple delays. So I'm going to scroll back one. Here we have 1 unit of delay for simplicity for math, but you can keep adding these delayed states and that you can put as many delays as you want. So here's an example with 2 delays, and you can just keep building this for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. Is this a unique implementation? You can probably guess that it is not. So here's 2 other potential implementations in terms of wiring circuits. Now, what I thought was a little bit amusing was that this diagram is actually the controllable canonical realization, which is a minimal realization. So what we did was we took this, let me scroll back one, we took this, we changed it into a transfer matrix, and then we did a standard realization upon the transfer matrix. It comes out diagrammatically pretty convoluted, even though it is a minimal realization. So it's minimal in terms of state, but it doesn't quite translate to a very nice looking picture. Nonetheless, all of these implement the same net transfer function. And so what can we say about feedback with delays? It's kind of the same story as before. With delays, you need to do internal dynamics for compensation. That's kind of shown with this here. So if you don't have internal dynamics, you're going to be performing with this blue line very bad. And how do you get internal dynamics? You do that through internal feedback. Okay. And finally, since we managed to do motor delay so easily, we figured why not just do this for the entire sensorimotor model. So you can put motor delay, sensor delay, and LQG all together. So this lets you to have sensor delay and motor delay. The nice thing about this diagram is that it basically retains all the sources of internal feedback from standard no delay LQG and motor delay LQR and sensor delay LQR. So if we look at the blue lines through A, B, and C, that's actually exactly the blue lines through A, B, and C here. And this loop looks quite a bit like that loop. And analogously, if you do the dual case for sensor delay, you'll get this one. So diagrammatically and mathematically, everything separates out very nicely. Now, implementation is not unique again. So even though we do have this implementation, and in our work that we published on this one, we did do a lot of interpretation of, what parts of the brain these could correspond to, but ultimately we don't know, because we could also take this, put it into a transfer function, do realizations, and then find a completely different circuit. This is one type of delay that we've considered here, but there's also other types of internal delays. So I'm going to give one more example of an internal delay that looks nothing like this one. Okay, so far we've been working with kind of like a scalar system. And even for a scalar system, you can get, quite a lot of variety in the circuitry that's possible. Let's now look at a two subsystem system. So let's say we have two subsystems. Maybe it is our arm and our shoulder. Our arm and our shoulder are dynamically coupled to each other, but they're, roughly speaking, separately controlled in the brain. What I mean by that is, in the brain, parts of the brain that are responsible for motor function, there are things called the homunculus. Homunculus is Latin kind of for mini person. So what that means is, in the motor cortex of your brain, there's a little patch that corresponds to your hand. There's a little adjacent patch that's corresponding to your elbow, roughly speaking, and there's another adjacent patch that's your shoulder, and another adjacent patch that's your trunk or your torso, and so on. So it's a very one-to-one mapping almost of your body in your brain. There's several parts of the brain with that. Okay, so the existence of the homunculus is suggesting that your brain is also naturally partitioned into these kind of local controllers. But your local controllers do also need to communicate to each other, but they're going to do so via some delay. Now, there's an ongoing kind of, not controversy, but kind of interesting finding, which is that everyone knows about homunculus, right? You poke the hand part of the brain, your hand will move, and so on. But there's also a lot of recent evidence about whole body signals in motor cortex around the homunculus. So it's saying, even though this part of the brain is responsible for the hand, if you do some signal processing, it turns out that it also contains whole body signals, which seems to be at odds with the idea of homunculus. Which is it? Is it the hand or is it the whole body? And if we take this model and do a similar analysis on it, so again, LQ performance and stability on the x-axis. Here's for stability. We've actually just started at unstable, and we're just looking at the unstable regime. And again, so if there's no delay, so if the two local controllers can communicate to each other instantaneously, then that's the bottom line there. It performs very well, very low cost. If you allow delayed internal feedback, so basically this structure, then you'll scale with the pink line. And if you have no feedback, so if you say these two local controllers cannot communicate to each other, then that's the blue line. And again, it fails to stabilize at some point. We basically hard-coded this for a 2x2, but to do this at scale with several subsystems, this becomes essentially distributed control and structured optimization. Now, if we look at this diagram, for relatively unstable tasks like 1.3, 1.4 eigenvalue, the no internal feedback and internal feedback actually still kind of match up quite well. It's only when you get even more unstable that these two lines diverge. And what this seems to be saying is that at some regimes, so let's say from this point leftwards, you don't actually need much communication. But for more difficult or perhaps more dynamically coupled tasks, that is when you need the feedback. Otherwise, you perform very bad. And so this is kind of a way to reconcile the two ideas of homunculus and whole body signals. You can use your homunculus as a homunculus. So, arm part in arm part of the brain and leg part in leg part of the brain when your task is easy or not very dynamically coupled, and you need whole body signals when there's more difficulty. Okay. So that wraps up the first project that I wanted to talk about. And to kind of summarize, from existing literature, we know that simple controllers can explain sensorimotor behaviors. That's the justification for why we're doing these controller to animal comparisons. Our work that I talked about today was that we looked at the motif of internal feedback in sensorimotor systems, and we concluded that they implement internal dynamics. And these dynamics are fundamental for performance in the presence of estimation or delay compensation. I've also kind of asked a lot of implicit questions, so I'll make that very explicit here. The open questions include, what are all the possible implementation, and which of these circuit implementations corresponds to biology? Because remember, ultimately, we want to be finding out from a scientific perspective what every neural circuit is doing, what kinds of signals they're encoding, and so on. And to find which implementation, I think the first natural step is to find all the possible implementations. And there's plenty of additional considerations. So today I primarily talked about delay, basically, but we can also think about the implementations in terms of metabolic cost. So every block and every wire in those diagrams costs energy to maintain. Adaptability. So learning is a core part of our motor function, and so any motor circuit probably has to be amenable to learning in some way. Evolvability. We know that our neural circuits were shaped through evolution, and so that might help us inform it, how these circuits developed and what the shape constraints are. Because, for example, you have to evolve through partially viable products. So you can't have kind of half a controller at some point and complete it later through evolution. More likely, you're having one simple loop and you're elaborating upon the loop. And finally, there's additional neuron and muscle properties, tons of them that I didn't talk about, including things like encoding, dynamics, different types of neurons and muscles, and so on. So I think to address these questions, if you are a distributed or resource-constrained control theorist, is a very good opportunity to apply similar mathematical tools. Okay, let me pause here for maybe a few seconds and see if anyone has a question about the first half before I start talking about flies. Okay, again, feel free to asynchronously type in the chat or something if you have a question at any point. So now I'm gonna, with the remaining time, talk about the next project, which is modeling sensorimotor delays in Drosophila. So let me quickly go back a few slides. This giant picture of LQG with sensorimotor delay, we used this one in this fly model. Okay, and this is in submission, but it's up on bioRxiv, and it has some nice figures that I'll talk about today. So when I talk to non-biologists, my first question that I get is, why are we studying flies? Why do we study insects in general? Well, insects are actually pretty interesting behaviorally. They too exhibit very robust locomotion in a variety of settings. If you ever try to swat a fly, you can attest to how robust their locomotion is, probably. But compared to the animals that we are fundamentally interested in, so humans basically, flies are much less complex. So humans have on the order of 80 billion neurons, whereas flies have 300,000 neurons, and the connections between these neurons are fully characterized, so very tractable to analyze. And since we're using control theory, we're hoping that by studying the flies, we can extract more general principles of sensorimotor control. Because remembering our previous very early introductory slide, where control theory applies to a bunch of different animals and suggests some kind of underlying principle. So maybe we can use this less complex organism to say something about the complex organisms. Okay, so we made a model, and this model does three key things, which I'll describe. So the first thing it does is to produce realistic three-dimensional joint kinematics. So that's how the joints of each leg move in space. It maintains a walking pattern. So we're going to be looking at walking in flies and not flight in flies. Flies actually spend most of their life walking as opposed to flying. So we want the model to maintain walking under perturbations. And finally, we want to explore tunable sensorimotor delays via the delay model that I talked about. Okay, so first, a little bit about what flies look like. Fly, like us, has a brain, and it has a thing like a spinal cord, but it's called a ventral nerve cord because there's no bone. And the ventral nerve cord is the thing responsible for communicating to each of the legs. So it sends out axons to each leg, and the delay from when it decides what to do and when the muscle actually does it is about 30 milliseconds, even in this tiny animal. The muscles then, act upon the body and the world. There's some force-torque interactions, and it senses them through proprioceptors. And these can sense things like angle, angular velocity, muscle length, and so on. And these proprioceptors then communicate back to the ventral nerve cord, or the spine, with a delay of about 6 to 9 milliseconds. So again, here in this tiny organism, this tiny loop is already about 40 milliseconds of delay. The experiment that my collaborators did for this project was they put a fly on top of a spherical treadmill and took videos of it walking. And then using computer vision techniques, they extracted time series of every angle of the legs. So here's one example. Here's that front leg, that angle. Here's a time series of it walking. And as a remark, flies actually walk really fast because, as you can see, it's oscillating basically 4 times in 1 second. Okay, so now we want to create a model for this, and we kind of inspired by this hierarchical layered architecture, we also made a layered architecture, and this is a per-leg model. So I'm going to start from the bottom of these 4 layers. At the very bottom, we have a dynamics model of the leg. So this is through standard kinematics techniques. We made a model of the leg, and we interact with it through the optimal controller. So this is the optimal controller that I showed a little earlier on, the delayed linear quadratic Gaussian, and it incorporates muscle delays and sensory delays. The optimal controller then communicates with the trajectory generator. So this is a neural network trained on the walking data from the flies, and it generates the most biologically realistic trajectory. And what the optimal controller does is it basically tracks whatever the neural net outputs. So this is all, again, on one leg. And here's the part that goes to the other legs. So we have on each leg, 3 to 5 joints, depending on your definitions. But we can characterize each leg in terms of walking phase with one number. So let's say you say leg down is 0 and leg up is pi, for example. And you send this phase information to a chromotor oscillator, which receives phase information from all 6 legs. And this serves to coordinate the phases between the 6 legs. Okay, so here's dynamics, controller, trajectory, and coordinator. I'm going to skip over these. So these are just the meanings of all the symbols. And I'm going to skip over that and just go to the full model, which is 6 legs. And each leg has a chromotor oscillator and the trajectory generator, controller, and dynamics. Okay. So here are some graphs of kinematics, and I'm actually probably gonna skip over this. Okay, so without saying exactly what these mean, the orange is the real data and the blue is the simulated data. And if you look at these plots, it's fair to say that they're quantitatively pretty close. These are per leg analyses, and roughly speaking, the average difference between our model and the data, the average is around the same as the measurement error from the computer vision method. So numerically, we can argue that on average, our model looks like the data, but it's more convincing to show you a video, which is what I'm going to do. If it plays, okay, hopefully everyone can see the video. And maybe it will take a bit of time. So this is real fly walking speed. It's 12 millimeters per second, very fast. And you can look at this and try to have a guess at which is model generated and which is data. Is anyone brave enough to actually go for a guess? Okay. One person has a. Although flies predominantly walk, curious to know why the wing movement was not considered for locomotion. That's a good question. I believe if you look at the videos, essentially the wings don't move much during locomotion. Sure, definitely for flying, it would be a very different story. But for walking, I think dynamically speaking, the legs kind of dominate. Thanks for the question. Okay, so let me also remind myself. Yes, okay, so the one on the left is data, and the one on the right is, yes, the one on the right is model generated. But hopefully this is convincing enough that, you know, they look qualitatively the same. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about perturbed kinematics. So the perturbations in our model, we consider two modes of perturbation. One is an impulse perturbation, and that's what you think it is. So we just poke all of the joints on all of the legs at one instant in time and then stop. So here, for example, here's some time series of specific angles on the fly, and we apply the poke here. The time series shape changes for the worse, but after a little while, it recovers back to normal walking. But here, for this window, at least it does walk kind of weirdly. Another mode we consider a more naturalistic one is the persistent stochastic perturbation. So at every time instant, we essentially roll a dice and see whether we should apply a perturbation, and then we draw from a Gaussian distribution of how big the perturbation is. We're trying to mimic something like, you know, a wind gust or just general environmental perturbations. Again, during perturbations, which is this green block here, walking is a little bit wonky, but it manages to recover afterwards. So we wanted to analyze what happens during perturbations. And unfortunately, we can no longer do the thing of comparing to data because we don't have data with perturbations, and it's experimentally kind of challenging to perturb the fly because it's very small. So we developed this PCA plus KDE method to give a numerical analysis of whether the model is walking normally. Skipping over the details and just coming to the end, we take any time series of the walking, we feed it into this kernel density estimator. And what the KDE does is it just tells us whether our time series looks like the data. High values, so -1 being the highest possible, means it looks very much like the data, and low values, -2, means it looks not very much like the data. And we're going to colloquially call these normal walking and abnormal walking. The baseline, so we use this to evaluate the actual data, and basically, even within the actual data, the fly walks oddly quite a bit. So the baseline, which is the average from data, is around -1.6. Okay, so now we're going to do a combination of showing that the fly walks fine with perturbations and that we can scan delays with this type of plot. Okay, so let's look at this left plot first of all. The y-axis is motor delay. So here we're holding the model with a fixed sensory delay of 10 milliseconds, which is around the physiological value. And we're scanning the motor delay from 0 to 60 milliseconds. On the x-axis is the perturbation strength, going from kind of weak to strong. And back on the envelope, these are the magnitudes of perturbations that you would expect kind of environmentally. So it's not possible to receive bigger perturbations than this. On the second plot, the x-axis is the forward speed. So let's look at the second plot first because it's not as interesting. Basically, the speed doesn't have a very significant effect on the quality of walking. So lighter color means normal walking, and darker color means abnormal and or bad walking. And so at forward speed, if you look at each row, it looks relatively regular. But if you look at the column, so let's say you look at forward walking speed of 6 millimeters per second, it looks fine for low motor delays. And then around 30 milliseconds is when it starts to look bad and or when it passes the baseline. For the motor delay plus perturbation strength, this one is more interesting. So first, we want to look at this first column here. So for 0 perturbation strength, it actually doesn't matter what your delay is. You walk decently throughout. And this is because if you have no perturbation, you can just predict into the future perfectly. So you can compensate perfectly for any delay using those internal feedback that we talked about. Now, if you look at a different, let's say we look at this column, then as you increase motor delays, at some point, you're going to walk worse and worse and worse, and then very bad. Similarly, if you look at a given row, if you have a fixed motor delay, then when you increase your perturbation strength, you walk worse. So these hopefully all intuitively make sense, right? More perturbation is bad, more delay is bad. I'll tell you what the white line is in a moment. So this is a scan over motor delay. We can do the same thing over sensory delays. So this is the exact same story. We fix the motor delay at the physiological limit, 30 milliseconds, and then we did these scans. So again, same story. Speed doesn't seem to have a great correlation on how the walking behaves, but in terms of delay, more delay is worse. So the top of the graph is darker than the bottom of the graph, and more perturbation is worse. So the right side of the graph is darker than the left side. So the dotted lines here are actually the physiological values. And what's interesting is that our models basically start walking poorly around the physiological value. So for motor delay less than physiological value, it walks above baseline, it walks good. And then for motor delays above the physiological value, it walks poorly. And this is kind of an interesting observation. And the way we chose to interpret it is that nature selects the biggest delay it can get away with. What I mean by that is that in any natural setting, and indeed in artificial settings as well, it costs more energy or money to make a smaller delay. In terms of nature, it costs more energy to make a faster muscle or to make a faster sensor or to make faster neurons, because faster neurons just have to be very wide. Now, if you have infinite delay, then that'll be very cheap. But then you're going to perform poorly. And if as an organism you perform poorly, meaning you walk poorly or you slip and fall or something, you die. And then that's also not very good, right? So there's a balance between performance and energy. And it seems what our model is suggesting is that nature says, okay, I will pick the biggest delay I can get away with while not compromising performance under reasonable, perturbations that we can expect from the environment. Okay. I think we're going to finish right on time. So the takeaways from the second part is, firstly, that the modular architecture with optimal control allows us to explore sensorimotor delays. In particular, the fact that we use different LQG controllers with different sensorimotor delays let us create these scans over different delay values, and it gave us some insight about how nature navigates this energy performance trade-off. Comparison to existing methods, ours is more modular, and so it's easier to do the scan, because a lot of existing methods, what they do is they'll just train a neural net on data, and then, with some fixed muscular delay. And if you want to explore different delay values, you would have to retrain it. What is this, like 100 more times, right, to get all these values. But for us, you actually keep the neural net constant. You don't have to retrain it. And all you have to do is make a new LQG controller with a different number of delays. So much faster. Similar to this idea, question. How did you arrive at classifying pore movement? So essentially what we called pore movement was, technically speaking, what is unlike nature. So we looked at a similarity index between the evaluated bout of walking and data. So if we gave it a time series of walking and it said it looked like data, we would say this is good movement because it's biological movement. Whereas if we gave it a time series and it said this doesn't look anything like data, we would classify that as poor data. Good question. Okay, back to the slide. So robust locomotion, and what we mean by that is maintaining some semblance of walking with perturbations. In our model, again, we don't do retraining, we only trained it once. And so a combination of pre-programmed behavior, which is the neural net, plus the controller, which rejects disturbances, allowed us to do robust locomotion in a variety of regimes. This is also kind of interesting, both for nature and for artificial autonomy, because what we're saying is you don't need to know or learn about every new perturbation or environment that you're going to encounter. This seems reasonable, right? Like, we don't want to be retraining our neural net every time we encounter a new type of terrain. What you can do is you have a predefined kind of nominal walking gait, and you try to stabilize around it or stabilize to it or reject disturbances by use of a lower level control reflex-like behavior. Okay, And finally, the potential extension to artificial autonomy here is that this modular architecture is not limited to flies at all. It can be used for biorealistic movement generation if you have data, essentially. If you have enough data and a controller, then you can try to use this modular architecture to generate realistic movement. Okay, I think that is everything I have, and we are finishing right on time. So thanks, everyone. And we have more questions.
Thank you, Lisa, for the great talk.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. So there is a question from Subrata. For training the movement, how many samples data on an average were considered?
This is a good question. So I believe we split it into, because there's a range of walking speeds, and also because it was a sphere, it also rotated. So for every, I want to say on the order of hundreds, basically, on the order of hundreds of time series in total. But the thing is that it was actually quite a diverse set because it was different speeds and different rotational settings as well. And so if we just want to say like walking forward at 12 millimeters per second with no rotation, then it becomes on the order of tens. So yeah, that was the idea.
Oh yeah, so Subrata says, thanks. I have a couple of questions. I mean, first of all, very exciting stuff. So one question I had was, in classic, let's say, autonomous robots, slowly now people are realizing that it might be worth to separate the performance-driven autonomy stack. So let's say you have a task and you want to accomplish it, and the kind of safety filters that are used to pitch in case something goes wrong, right? And in some sense, this is separation of the two dynamics or the two kind of behaviors. And I wonder if that finds any match with how biological systems work. Like there are some things that are used, some parts of the brain or some parts of the cognition that are used for the task, the execution of the task, and then some safety mechanism that is. I mean, it would be nice if something like that could emerge from biology.
The thing that would bring to mind for me is things like reflexive behavior. And so, yeah, like it's not quite the same. I feel like safety and just reflex is closer to me for like a stabilizing element than a safety, but there is a safety involved. So my favorite example is like if you're a child and someone is cooking and you touch the pot, you will retract, and the retraction is the safety movement that's reflexive. You don't mentally control it. And so if you think about autonomy being, it depends on what you mean by autonomy, but again, like if you think about like the conscious things we can think about when we're doing decision making and so on, and all the unconscious processes below it, there's a lot of things that we will just unconsciously do for safety and or stability that for good reason we don't have access to from the top level of autonomy. Like for example, you cannot stop yourself from breathing consciously. Like you will stop breathing, you will give up, and then you will start, right? So there's kind of these limits built into the system. And I think it's like a good design feature of biology that we don't have access to actually most of these fail safe, in terms of autonomy, if you will. In terms of other parts of the brain, so I think like how I think about it is that different parts of our nervous system are providing abstractions to one another. And when we get to the highest level, like consciousness, you have access to a bunch of abstractions. Like if I do a motor task, I am never thinking about individual joints, right? Like I think of it very, very shortly, and the abstraction takes care of that. And built into these abstractions are already some level of safety and stability, so that we don't have to concern the like highest level autonomous level with that. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's super fascinating. And also my questions are really I don't know much about this, so it's it might be that they are totally naive. Another question that comes to mind is I work with multi-agent systems, and I wonder if similar thoughts, especially the architecture part of your design, of your research, could be applied to how these biological systems coordinate, like for example, ants being in line one after the other, or birds flying in some formations. I guess it's from the dynamics perspective, it's just a larger dynamical system, right? In some sense.
It's also a more mobile dynamic. So the dynamical
Right.
network is like much more reconfigurable for swarms than it would be for something like a neural network. Like at some point, there's fixed circuits that you can find like with every human, most humans, for example. And so I think there's a higher level of reconfiguration within the network for swarm versus for a static brain network. Of course, your brain reconfigures as well, but with a lower, lower level of change and movement, I would say.
Oh yeah, Subrata has another question. How do you compare the motor delay between an ant and a human?
This is a good question. So like there was one example of each, like fly. So fly, I don't know about ants, but like let's say fly, which is another insect. Fly, what we said, it was like 30 milliseconds for that spinal circuit, and in the example for the animal spinal circuit, it was also 30 milliseconds. And part of the reason is that size is also related to delay. So as I alluded to, bigger neurons are faster, but like our biggest neuron is approaching the thickness of a fly itself. And so even though the smaller animals have a smaller distance to conduct through, they also cannot have such a big neuron, basically, for conduction. And for muscles, I'm not as familiar with muscles, but I believe there are like similar principles there where a larger muscle is able to ramp up force faster. And so I think this is actually a sort of active research area, the scaling of this type of thing between different animals. But the paper that I cited for that part would be like a good one to start if I can find it. Yeah, this one, scaling of sensorimotor delays in terrestrial animals, might give you some answer. But roughly speaking, we don't really know. Yeah.
That's great. Any other question for Lisa? I think in your last slide, you left your email in case people want to reach out. I mean, this is super exciting work. I will, for sure, you got me very interested, and I will go and read papers now about this. Thank you again very much for the talk.
All right. Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining. I see you all next week for the next Autonomy Talk. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.